it seems like at least every like 3 or 4 weeks, I'm quoting from something from Pew. And so it's just great to have Courtney here as part of the community. And I just add my gratitude. Loving God, we thank you for the gift of hearts and minds, for our adult education community near and far, for Courtney and her work and willingness to share her gifts with us in this group this morning. Bless us in our time together. In Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
I'm going to go dial in and listen, see if I can get it to work.
Our speaker this morning is Courtney Shea, who comes from the Pew Research Organization, and who is one of the people behind a new survey that hasn't even been published yet.
Wow.
As giving us a sneak preview into how churches have responded to the pandemic with technology. And here we are with a live example of that. And I got a chance to look at her slide presentation in advance, and it's really interesting. So welcome, Courtney.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's a joy to be with everyone this morning. I think it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting if there weren't some technical difficulties. So that's all to be expected. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Steve, how's that looking? Good. All right. Well, yeah, so it's just so wonderful to be with everyone this morning. It's also a bit humbling, I have to say, because I've seen some of the recent presentations you guys have had in adult education, and they're just so tremendous. I remember the one fellow talking about, installing solar panels in Africa and Asia, and just to think about what a direct impact and wonderful impact to have on people's lives. By contrast, what I'm going to show you is much more of an indirect impact on society. As Steve said, at Pew Research Center, we do surveys. And we do them with the intention of just putting out high quality, trustworthy facts and information that is hopefully useful to people who are religious leaders, business leaders, government leaders, and normal folks as well. And so I'm going to share the results with you of a fairly recent survey we did that looks at the intersection of religion and technology. Yeah, I'm going to try to advance. There we are. It will become clear pretty quickly. I myself am not a religious scholar. I'm blessed to work with a bunch of folks who are, though. And so that's why I have this slide. These are the folks I work with who are really our experts on Christianity, on Jewish Americans, Muslim Americans, and so forth. And it's a total, they're actually my favorite. There's a bunch of different teams at Pew I get to work with. The religion guys are my favorite. And so what I'm going to share with you is really more the fruits of their labor. They wrote the questions and are working very hard on doing a formal report of the survey that I'm going to share with you. So you're getting a bit of a sneak preview this morning.
Oh, good.
And so, as I mentioned, Pew is a non-partisan, non-profit, non-advocacy, looking to just produce high-quality, trustworthy information. Okay, so in terms of what we were trying to do with this particular survey, I'd say we're trying to get at 3 overarching questions. The first one has to do with what does religious attendance look like coming out of the pandemic, at least with lockdowns over for the most part. As we know, when the lockdown started, a lot of people who had been going in person, were not able to do so. And many of them tried the virtual options. And then the lockdowns ended, and now where are we, right? We've got a lot of people coming back, not everyone. A lot of people who, are still doing the virtual options. Some people are doing both. And so we were really curious to learn what that looked like at this point. So November being, after the lockdowns had stopped. Second, we wanted to hear about people's experiences. What is it like for folks attending worship in person versus virtually? We know they're different, but what do people have to say about the pluses and minuses of those 2 different experiences? And third, if we just set a religious service aside, there's a whole bunch of technologies that relate to that are religion focused that people are also trying out in their lives. And so we're curious which of these technologies, whether it be an application on an app on your phone or a podcast. How popular are those? Who's using those? What are they? What's their effect on people's lives? Okay. And so, as I said, I'm not a religious scholar. My background is actually more in statistics in the design of surveys. So my whole focus is on this one slide out of like 50. I'll just tell you a bit about how the survey was actually conducted. So years ago, we polled on the phone, like a lot of public opinion organizations. But about 10 years, we started migrating our work online. But it's really important to us to represent the whole country. And we know not everybody uses the internet. And so these days, we start the process offline. We actually draw a national random sample of addresses. The Postal Service actually makes that available. So we start with a sample of home addresses. We actually contact people through the mail. We send them a letter with a few dollar bills in there, explain the process, and then ask them to go online and take surveys for us. And if we reach people who don't have the internet, we actually provide them with a tablet, data plan, and IT support. So that's broadly how this all comes together. This particular survey, as I said, was conducted in the second half of November of last year. We interviewed over 10,000 US adults. And just, by chance, proportionally, we get about 250 Presbyterians as part of that sample. Okay, now I'm gonna get into some of the results. If anybody has a question, I guess that's gonna be a little more challenging than usual, but please just raise your hand.
I'll keep an eye on it.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Okay, so like I said, we wanted to ask people about attending religious services. And so we asked about attending a church, synagogue, mosque, or other house of worship at least once or twice a month. Now, we have more detailed data. We could look at that by weekly attenders or less often. But for today, I'm going to focus on that at least once or twice a month break, because it's a way to get people for whom attending service is at least something of a regular part of their lives, right? If you go at least once or twice a month, you get people who do that fairly regularly, maybe not every Sunday, but not sort of just Christmas and Easter folks, but people for whom this is a real part of their lives. And we asked separately about attending in person versus watching online or on TV. And, at this point in time, about 30% of US adults say that they attend religious service in person. And if you look at watch online or on TV, it's close to a quarter of US adults. And I don't know about you, but I was a little surprised that second number was as high as it was. Yes.
Yeah, that's one of my questions is when you grab your sample and you have your people, is that representative of the United States? Are you getting people in cities? Are you getting people who live in apartments? I mean, are you getting young people? I mean, do you look at what your demographic is and how well it matches the US population?
Yes, absolutely. By virtue of, the sample we draw is not haphazard. It's called stratified, which means that we make sure we get the number of people in Delaware that, proportional to that, and the number of people in Texas proportional to that, and all similar with cities, various geographies. In terms of the demographics, the sample that we get, the people who take the survey, it comes reasonably close, but some people are more likely to take surveys than others. That's absolutely true. People who went to college are more likely to take surveys than people who didn't. And older Americans tend to be more likely to take surveys than younger Americans. And so what we did, and that's where my job comes into effect, we statistically weight the data. So for example, about 35% of US adults just went to high school. And if you look at the people who took our survey, that might be like 25%. So I increased the influence of that 25% to make it hit that national parameter of 35%. So at the back end, we do a little statistical tweaking of the data to fix some of those imbalances.
You do that for age as well?
Age, gender, education, race, ethnicity. We actually adjust on about 12 different variables. Because as you guys know, like response rates to surveys are low these days. And so we have to do more work on the back end to adjust for that than we used to. And really, education, I would say, is the biggest one. The good news is we know from the Census Bureau, we rely heavily on them. We know from the Census Bureau what that number should be. And so it helps that we can fix that by increase their influence. So it's proportional, their voice is proportional to what it should be in the data. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Okay, so as you can see that on watching virtually, it's not quite as prevalent as going in person, but it's not too far behind, right?
Right.
And then we can look at that because we have such a large sample, we can look at that by religious tradition. And I'm only going to do this once because this pattern kind of looks the same for the other questions I'm going to show you, but we can look at it by Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and so forth. And the pattern that you see on a lot of the questions that we ask, if we're asking about anything about attendance, religious engagement, doing various religious activities, tend to see relatively high levels from people who identify as born again or evangelical, and also people who identify as belonging to a historically Black Protestant church. They tend to see higher levels of attendance and engagement from those folks than mainline Presbyterian or mainline Protestants, for example. And you guys might already be aware of this, but if we look specifically at Presbyterians, about 2/3 nationally identify as mainline, and about 1/3 would identify as evangelical or born again. And so we see the attendance levels for mainline Protestants are broadly similar to what we see with Catholics and Jewish adults, a little bit lower than evangelical. All right, the one thing though that I thought was interesting with this particular slide is that for almost all the groups, you see more people attending in person than watching online or on TV. But the one group for whom that's different is people who are in historically Black Protestant churches. For them, we actually found higher levels of watching online or on TV than attending in person. I just thought that was pretty interesting. Yeah.
Surprising.
Yeah.
And then the other relationship that I saw in the data I wanted to share with you had to do with income. Now, if we start with in-person attendance, there's really no association there. You know, whether you attend in person, it doesn't seem to be much related to income level. But if we look at watching online or on TV, it's actually significantly more popular among lower income adults than higher income adults. And I know one of the themes, Steve, is sort of hopeful findings and hopeful learnings. If anything, I would inclined to say that that's kind of hopeful, right? To my mind, if this new technology is going to be particularly useful to some segment of the population, I was happy to see that it's particularly useful among lower income adults, right? Because if it had been a huge boon and benefit to wealthy Americans, well, they don't necessarily need any help, right? But so I thought that this relationship in the data was interesting. And it doesn't seem to be detracting from in-person attendance either, right? We don't see a particularly low rate of in-person attendance. We just see what looks like a relatively high rate of taking advantage of the virtual option. Okay. And then we asked people to reflect on the frequency of going to worship now versus before the COVID-19 pandemic started. And if we start off looking at what people said about their in-person attendance, we do see kind of what you'd expect, which is the people who are going in person less often, that 20% is a little bit higher than the people who are say they're going more often, right? This sort of reflects the fact that in-person attendance, you know, probably isn't quite at the level that it used to be. But if we look at virtual attendance, watching online or on TV, there we see the opposite. There we see that 15% more people attending in person outpaces the people, the share of people who are saying they're doing that less often.
The time frame on this is important, isn't it?
It is. Yes, it's November of 2022.
Which is when people were starting to feel more comfortable going back into social situations.
Yes, absolutely. So we don't think that, right, this is not locked in stone. These numbers are going to move, and we would expect or at least I would expect, again, I'm not a religious scholar, but I would expect that the in-person number in particular might grow as more and more people still get comfortable. Yes,
And likewise, if this had been done a year earlier, just as Omicron was emerging,
yes,
you would have seen people not going in person
Right.
virtually at all.
absolutely. Yes, that's absolutely right. Yep. And then this was interesting. So a number of people do both. I'm one of them, I have to say. We asked the people who say they both go in person and join online sometimes, which one they prefer. And perhaps not surprisingly, overwhelmingly, those folks say that they prefer going in person, about 3/4. But about 10% say that they actually do prefer watching online or on TV. And I'm going to share with you what that looks like by age. I thought this was interesting. If you look at young adults, so ages 18 to 29, who are religious, right? They have told us that they attend religious services. They're like twice as likely to actually prefer that virtual option relative to older adults who attend religious services. And now we're going to get into some of what we're excited to learn about with the experience. So we wanted to hear the people who said they prefer the in-person experience. We wanted to hear was that in your own words, please tell us why you prefer going in person. I'm going to share with you. And then, so I had a data set, right, with like thousands of people wrote out their answers. I read through those. And I'm going to share with you some of the main themes that I saw in the data. So a big one was fellowship, right? People say they enjoy being able to the fellowship with their friends when they physically go to church or house of worship. A number of people specifically mentioned Hebrews 10:25 and what that says about meeting together and that being important to them. A lot of folks talked about they actually feel closer to God if they go to their house of worship relative to just participating virtually. Some people talked about fewer distractions, trying to focus on religion when they're at their house of worship. Some people mentioned receiving communion, right? That's more readily available, a different experience in person. And then, somebody said, I'm in the band, right? If you're actually part of the music program, that's definitely a different experience as well. Okay, now on the flip side, we wanted to hear the folks who actually prefer going online or on TV, what's on their minds, what motivates their decisions. Definitely a lot of people mentioned COVID-19 and concerns around that. Other folks talked about the functionality, right? If you're joining remotely and you particularly enjoyed some part of the service, you can go back and listen to it again as many times as you'd like, and that feature being important. Certainly, a lot of people talked about physical limitations, health concerns, and the virtual option making more sense for them. So some people talked about dressing up, the formality of attending in person on Sunday, maybe not being their favorite. Some folks talked about the crowds and the traffic. I don't know. I presume maybe these are people more like mega church attenders. I don't know that we have that problem here at Bradley Hills, but for some people that was an issue. And this final theme I thought was really interesting, and it's something we're going to explore more in this survey, which is the notion that if you're joining remotely, the barriers of time and space disappear, right? Like you can, in theory, attend a worship service that is happening anywhere in the world because you're linked by technology. And we had one person say, the pastor whose services I watch is a more compelling and dynamic speaker. And you can see I put in here some pictures of Denise and David because, but I'm almost certain, right? Statistically, it's almost impossible that the person who said this is actually a Bradley Hills member. But it reminded me of our friends in Florida and our friends in Minnesota and elsewhere. Yeah. I don't yet know you folks personally, but I would not be surprised if a big reason why you choose to live stream in is because we are blessed with wonderful pastors, right? And so people can use the technology to take advantage of that. And we did see that come up.
On behalf of the congregation, let me express the hope that as this becomes a presentation to wider audiences, you keep those two pictures.
I can do that as long as they're comfortable with me doing that outside the church. Absolutely. Yeah, I think they're great examples, aren't they? Yeah. Okay, so we wanted to hear people's unfiltered thoughts, but we also were data people, so we wanted to also kind of try to put numbers on this. So later in the survey, we asked the people who liked that remote option, we gave them some specific reasons that we thought might be the most popular reasons. And we said, is this a major reason you like virtual, a minor reason, or is this not a reason you like virtual? And when we asked it that way, the most popular one that people said was actually convenience. About 44% said that was a major reason. But this second one was the one I just talked about. It allows me to watch services that are held far away from where I live. That was also a pretty popular choice there, reflecting, a major reason why people do this. And then, health concerns and other things were a little bit lower down the list, but we definitely do see that when we ask it as a closed-ended question as well. Okay, now trying to get at it a little bit differently. We ask people who say that they attend virtually. When you do this, are you attending the service? Are you live streaming in to the house of worship you go to in person, a house of worship other than the one you go to in person, or both? And the way I look at this, I think it makes sense to kind of combine those last two categories. I read this as a majority, actually, the people who are going virtually, a majority are at least some of the time live streaming in, attending a house of worship other than the one that they go to in person, which is, I think, a substantial finding there. And then we're curious, when you do this, is it sort of a solitary activity? Are you doing it by yourself, or are you doing this with other folks? And again, here, I think we see more of a 50-50 split. About half of folks say that they attend virtually by themselves. And about half say that they do that, bless you, with other people, or it depends, which I take to mean sometimes it's by themselves and sometimes it's with other people. So that kind of looks split. And then we were interested in knowing, when people are attending online or on TV, what is it in terms of, how engaged they are, how participatory it is. So the way we asked it is, how often do you do the things you would normally do if you were attending the service in person, like praying out loud, saying responses out loud, singing, or kneeling? And about 40% of folks said that they all or most of the time they do those things that they would do in person. But it's a larger share, I would say that they do that only some of the time, a little, or not at all. And so I take this to mean that when most people are watching virtually, it is a different experience. It's a little less interactive and participatory, which is, probably what you'd expect. I would say, though, as a researcher, while some of these slides, some of these findings might be like, well, that's what we would have thought. I would say the reason we ask the question is that we try to approach this process with humility. We might have a strong suspicion that if we ask a question of Americans, we're going to find something, but we never want to assume that, sort of the way we think the world is in our heads is in fact the way it is, because often we're surprised. And so sometimes when we, gather the data, it kind of lines up with what you would have expected, and sometimes it doesn't. But we always, sort of respect, the population enough to let them tell us and not have us just make assumptions.
They can't hear you.
Okay. And so digging in a little bit deeper about in-person versus virtual, we wanted to ask specifically about two aspects of worship service. And one of them was music. And here we did see a difference, right? So if we ask about how satisfied are you with the music in person, we get about 3/4 extremely or very satisfied with the music in person. That drops all the way down to 60% if they say that they're attending virtually. It's different though with sermons. With sermons, it's much more comparable. Again, about 3/4 say that they're very or extremely satisfied with sermons when they go in person. And when it's virtually, it's 71%, which is a little bit lower, but I'd say much more in the ballpark. There's much less drop off in how people experience the sermons in person versus online. And when I think about these findings, I mean, it makes sense, right? We have a fabulous music program, but this isn't a concert hall, right? It's probably not mic'd to get all the voices and all the instruments, right? I mean, it's just not possible to do that. Whereas with the sermon, the bar is much lower, right? One mic, you got one speaker. It's much easier, I think, to capture that experience of a sermon versus the entire music. And so I do think we see that reflected in the data. Another element of worship, right, is connecting with friends at the house of worship. And so we wanted to try to get at that. So we asked people, how much of a connection do you feel when you're in person, connecting to the other people who are also in person? And there we see, quite a lot. 2/3 say that they feel a good deal or quite a bit of connection when everybody's in person. It's very different when you're virtual, right? So we asked about when you're watching online or on TV, how much of a connection do you feel with the people who are at the house of worship, who are in person? And it drops all the way down to 30% saying that they feel that strong connection. Again, kind of what you'd expect, but we definitely do see that. And then we even asked about, so this is for the folks across the country there, if you're remote, what is your connection with the other people who are also remote? So like our friends in Florida, thinking about how much of a connection do they have with friends in Minnesota and so forth. And some people do feel that connection, right? You get about close to 1/4 say that they feel a great deal or quite a bit of connection. But for a lot of people, it is less. So we do see that connection is not quite as strong, when folks are remote. And when I reflect on these data, I wonder if there's, in 5 or 10 years, if we might figure out some technical way to bridge that gap a little bit more, to make people feel more connected, whether it's more chats or I don't know what the technical solution would be. But I see this as room for improvement in trying to bolster those connections. Interesting thing here, if we look at this by age, I won't show you all the numbers because the data just gets overwhelming at a point, but if we look at this among young people, the young people were less likely to feel that when everybody's in person, they're less likely to feel that, but they were more likely to feel connected when they were remote. And I think that maybe reflects just how young people have a different relationship with technology, right? Yeah. For them, when they think about connecting with other people, I think that being remote is just not as much of a barrier for them. Again, I'm just kind of reading into the data here, but that's kind of what we see. And maybe that's something of a hopeful finding, right? If young people, if this is a way to bring them in and they do feel more of a connection, perhaps that's a good thing in the long run. I don't know.
Well, unless you believe that in the long run, it's better for people to be in person. I mean,
yes.
I think I think it's a little sad, but so
that's fair.
Because we're a social being, and think that people need to. Yeah, especially you can't have a baby unless you're in person. So if you're gonna have the race keep going, if we only do virtual stuff, we'll, whatever. So I'm kind of joking, but I just think I don't think you want it to become a replacement.
Yes.
Or the only thing, maybe if it brings them in and then maybe they become an in-person attender.
I agree. We wouldn't want to undercut the people going in person. And as a mom who's struggling mightily to, keep the phones away from children as long as possible, I can say amen to that. Yeah, I'm not.
Yeah, and the bad article about the teenage girls and stuff. I mean, we don't. The whole idea of continuing online stuff is making me a little nervous if the church is in one more place where we do online stuff, so.
That's anyway. A good point. Yeah, that's a good point. So this next one, I think is a hopeful finding. in terms of, we asked people about the technology, the quality of the audio and the video at their house of worship, thinking before the pandemic versus where they are now. And we do see a majority of folks, who are engaged with the house of worship say that has improved since the COVID-19 pandemic. I imagine a lot of Bradley Hills members would feel similarly. There's a good chunk of folks who say it stayed about the same, but only a very small share who say that that's gotten worse. So it does seem that the pandemic was, a motivation to improve all these technological connections. Okay, so in the last section, last bit of findings I want to share with you is looking at things outside of worship. And we started asking about very lo-fi, like books and radio and whatnot. And so we asked, so these are based on all US adults now, about a third say that they read religion-focused books. About a quarter say that they listen to religious radio stations. And about 1 in 5 said that they attend prayer group, scripture study, or religious education. And then we asked about more tech-intensive things like podcasts and religion-focused apps on their phone and whatnot. And we see that about 1 in 5 Americans say that they use an app to help them read scripture. Similar shares say that they use an app to help them be grateful. Similar number using social media to post or share things. About 15% said that they listen to a religion-focused podcast, and so on. And so, I was reflecting on these data and how to think about them, right? Because they're not huge numbers, right? We don't have majorities of Americans doing these things, but they're also not small numbers either, right? I mean, if you think about, there's over 200 million adults in the US. If we have roughly 14% saying that they're using an app to help them pray, I mean, we're talking about millions of people, like on the order of 28 million or so people. So I do actually think that these numbers, in the high teens and the 20s, they actually reflect millions and millions of people. So if you think about it that way, I actually do think that this substantial share of the country is actually engaging with these different technologies.
One of the things that we noticed at Bradley Hills, and I can speak for this group, but I think it applies across the board, is that at the beginning of the pandemic, as we ramped up our online presence, there was a tremendous increase in participation. When we first started adult education in late April of 2020, we were getting 65 screens on Zoom.
Wow.
And that translates to almost 100 people.
Yeah.
In person before the pandemic, it had been about 20. It's dropped off to now, but now we're still higher than we were pre-pandemic. And I think that's happened with other church groups as well. We did, for a while, we were doing Sunday school for kids online. And that started off really high and then dropped back to sort of pre-pandemic levels.
Okay.
I can't speak for other congregations. And there's such a variety of different platforms that congregations use that it's really hard to track this.
Yep. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Huh. That's really interesting. So, well, that pretty much brings us to the end of what I wanted to share. The last bit I had here is, again, with these technologies, we see that relationship I mentioned kind of at the start, which is if you look at the data, if you were to say, for whom are these particularly useful or popular, it's with less wealthy Americans. Lower income Americans are more likely to say that they use these technologies, which I'm going to chalk up, at least in my own mind, to a hopeful finding. So I really appreciate you guys giving this a listen, and happy to take it if there's any more questions.
I have one, Stu.
Carol?
Overall, does it seem that the proportion of the population has dropped with respect to religious activities or increased? And how does that look?
I'm gonna have to defer to my colleague. I'd say we're actually working on that analysis right now. So one thing that we're gonna be able to do that I haven't shown you here. I just showed you one survey, one point in time, November of last year. But actually there's the way that surveys work now, people agree to take surveys for us on an ongoing basis. So there's people for whom we've been in contact since 2014, 2015, all the way to today. And so what we can do is actually look at the same set of people, follow them over time. And we've asked them about religion at least once or twice a year for years going before the pandemic and to now. And so we can do a more detailed analysis to answer that question. So it's such an important question. I wouldn't want to just give you my own gut impression, because my colleagues are taking a serious look at that. And I believe sometime later this year, they're gonna put out their answer to that. And one of the reasons that they haven't put out this report yet is they're busy working on a huge multi-million-dollar survey to try to answer this, not just for the religious groups that are larger that we can talk about with all of our surveys, Protestants, Catholics, and so forth, but to do a survey large enough, over 30,000 people, that we can answer that question for Hindus, for Sikhs, for Muslims, and for all the smaller groups as well. Because I don't know, maybe it could be that overall it looks one way, but if you dig down into different religious traditions, that there's some differences there. So we're working on those answers. I'm sorry, I don't have it today.
Great.
We have a comment from Joni. What a wonderful presentation.
Yes.
Online worship means the world to me, and I'm so happy that BHPC provides us with such great opportunities.
Amen.
That's we've sort of internalized what a revolution we've had in the church in the past 3 years.
Right? Big deal.
Before the pandemic, I think the only online presence we had was the live stream of the worship services. And now most of the lay ministries meet either via Zoom or in hybrid meetings. We've got our small groups, many of them are via Zoom. And it's allowed us to bring in people like Joni and all the folks at Bradley Hills South.
Absolutely.
And from the perspective of those of us here, it's allowed us to broaden our sources of inspiration and learning. How many times have we had remote speakers come to adult ed that we could otherwise not have been able to access? And last summer we had a speaker from Pakistan.
Yeah, that was good.
It was good reception.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So I love.
No, I really think it's kind of profound when you think about the barriers of time and distance going away, right? The website we have is so good, you can watch services from years ago, which I've done on occasion, and I've dialed in from my in-laws in Florida and watched a service. It really is quite amazing. Helps us build community, and it's just terrific.
Yeah, that's what I thought of with the lower income. I thought maybe for them, if they're working 3 jobs or 2 jobs, or something, you can kind of fit in your church when you can, or you don't have the funds for the gas to get to the church or something. So I think that's very valid. The only thing I want to say is I don't know if this model holds for children. And so we have to be careful that it works great for adult ed, but it's not going to work for children, not for teens. And so you want to be sure that you continue to build a church that has in-person presence for those groups, and maybe their parents too, because the kids don't drive themselves to church. So, so.
I'm with you 100%.
Yeah.
We were thinking about joining for years, but during the pandemic with little kids, I mean, it's kind of a non-starter to have that, like going to a website be the introduction to religion and faith, right? We had to wait until Bradley Hills reopened, and this, not long after, we certainly joined. So because it was in person with children.
Amy wants to say something that we can't hear, so.
You can't hear me.
Peggy, you'll have to type something in.
Oh,
So, David.
David, you have to type in.
I'll just
Joni's, is yellow mean they're typing?
That's
How
just
this-
one-
David's just gonna walk down the hall. Excellent.
So sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, so strange.
Yeah. Yeah, the other participants said they could hear David, but we can't. The
Yeah.
problem is very specific to us.
Yeah.
So it's two adult heads.
There's another question in the chat that you could get on to.
We did. We thought we did. Well, I mean, we've been pulling our hair out with that.
We need better mics
Yeah.
to do all of this. In that we only have two that we can use, lapels. And they sometimes are not working and that's an issue.
Sorry.
I just got. So we'll talk.
That's tough.
Need-
So, I'm so glad that you and John, I'm just interrupting everything.
Please do.
Just interrupting everything. I gotta stop doing this. Well, because Courtney said that she and John and Andrew and Abby, it's like so many others who can't, we have so many folks, families who are on hold because you can't have a 3-year-old who's gonna spend an hour watching church. It just doesn't work. And as Rosanna said, I mean, that's our growth, fortunately, that's 2/3 of our growth right now. And so how do we mold as an intergenerational congregation, these different models where it is probable? I think Evelyn's question was a good one. I think in the chat about we permanently have, I would say, I think 1/5 of our congregation is sort of permanently online to 25% online any given week. And that has a little bit to do with travel patterns and everything from hospitalizations and the fact that we've been broadcasting since 2012. So you have Bradley Hill South and other people who are just part of our community online. But it does reflect and COVID and other things. And that is the combination of the perma diaspora combined with the ability to stay home when you need to, combined with the need for in-person everything. And I just wanted to say as I think about strategic planning, I was thinking about Shizuko. Some of the satisfaction numbers that you were listing earlier around worship and parts of worship, comparing, for instance, music versus sermons, I heard you sort of talking about. Those things are really interesting as we think about connection and worship, which are connection and celebration are the likely near two of the top things that, at least numerically, in the strategic plan. So anyway, I can't remember the question. I forgot it on the way down here, but I just wanted to say thank you. I just wanted to say thank you.
David, let me read for this group,
Yeah.
Evelyn's comment, and then ask you a question.
Yeah.
Has virtual worship changed more permanently the way we do church? In other words, will brick and mortar churches become significantly switched for cyber churches, especially as the young grow older? And my question is, how does our attendance now, as compared to 2019, look on live versus live stream at the 10:30 service?
Yeah, so our overall attendance is similar to 2019. It is higher overall than last year. But as you mentioned, there was a big spike in early 2020 overall, as far as we could tell. There's a lot more people. There are different ways that we try to calculate the imperfect number of exactly how many eyeballs are watching on a Sunday morning. It's an imperfect estimate, right? In the Gray household, is the number 5 or is it 1? If Bridget's got the TV on. So, but it's way higher. I mean, it's multiples higher than in 2019.
And what you see.
Wow.
there.
It was a question, what's our online attendance now versus 2019, like now? Yeah, multiple. I mean, last week it was 130 or something. It was very high, much higher than it usually is last
And
week.
130, as you say, could be out higher. than that.
Yeah, that's a high number. It's usually not that high, but it was like 8 before in 2019 or 16 or it was like the 8:30 service. It was multiples lower than the 10:30, and now it's way higher than the 8:30.
Well, and it goes up as the week goes on, right? Because not everybody watches live.
Yeah, I mean, that is also true. There's a whole, when we send it, I don't even count that.
No,
We don't
that's
don't
true.
capture that, but when we send it out on the Tuesday email, we know that there are people who will watch it based on the
Yeah.
Tuesday email.
And how
that's-
about in person, David? Are we half of what we were in person, a third? What are we running?
Yeah, I'd say, so we throw out, I'd say 2/3. I'd say 2/3 to 3/4, maybe 2/3 is what I would say
We might be higher than before as far as the.
overall.
Susan Vandiver has a really important comment here.
Go ahead, listen.
Session, take note. I think we need to consider these findings in terms of our future focus and investments. For example, we should invest in more microphones, and each lay ministry should have some remote worshiper participants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Susan's right about, I mean, Worship and Arts, to its credit, has talked about that question of the remote members. Obviously, Adult Ed has folks in there, and as Andy is trying to lead us in terms of mics, yeah, I mean, we're getting one new piece of equipment finally. And then mics and cameras, I think, are probably next.
Yeah.
Courtney, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
for
No,
having
it
me.
really,
Yeah,
excellent.
thank you, David.
Thanks all.
That was very, very helpful.
That was a great
We
presentation.
always wish as we're participating remotely, that they would leave the cameras on as then at the end of the service, as people are leaving, so you can see who's there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
rather than they shut it off as soon as Matthew stops playing. I mean, and it's too fast.
I attended a Presbytery-wide discussion of how various congregations are doing their Sunday morning services via Zoom, of course.
Yeah,
And one congregation downtown had one of their audiovisual team members who had a camera on a shoulder-mounted gimbal. And he walked slowly down the center aisle of church so that everybody was approaching him at the end of the service. And that was really powerful.
Yeah.
That was the most admired feature by the members of the congregation.
Have to.
Yeah, the pastor, that's fine. The section leader singing, that's okay. But seeing my friends' faces.
right.
Yeah, and I think it was during the pandemic, but we had, I think it was around Christmas, we had people, a small group discussions going among people as
Yeah.
we had, I don't know,
Yeah.
after service, open house kind of thing.
And a
I
couple of
think
functions,
they're-
we've had people carrying a laptop around. So that
Yeah,
people who were present could say hi to people online.
yeah. And yeah, we can follow through more with that. Yeah.
So with that introduction, I would love to hear the reactions from this group. Just send a note to me via email.
Joni, that's funny.
Yeah, Joni, who usually sat toward the back of the sanctuary.
Yeah.
So she recognizes people by the back of their heads.
Yeah.
If you've got a reaction to how technology has affected the way you participate, send it to me. I'll share it with David and the church leadership, because Susan's comment, I think, does point to something that we need to think about more. And even informal and anecdotal input is really important. It doesn't have to be scientific. It's just hearing from members about what this means to them personally would be very, very informative, I think. Thank you so much, Courtney. We look forward to seeing this when it becomes official.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you, everyone.
And I'll talk to you later, and we'll explore the possibility of taking this show on the road. I think that this is a presentation that the Presbyterian General would be very interested in seeing.
I'd be very happy to do that. Absolutely. And we'll have an answer to your
Yeah.
really good question.
Yeah, I'm surprised you got permission to even share this.
I didn't.
Don't tell it, still live.
You said about taking it further. I thought you better check with her.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I told him I can't, amongst friends, 40
Yeah.
friends, it's fine, but I have to wait for the official
Yeah.
publication
Well, I
before I
know.
take it outside the church.
We're gaining more respect for pews.
It's going to be published. I know that they want to keep their.
Yes.
Yeah.
Published on it.
And honestly, if we had like someone who's actively a reporter for a major news outlet, I couldn't do it, but I
Yeah.
figured this crowd probably
Right.
not
Yeah.
the case, so it's okay. Yeah, I'd love to. Steve.
Okay,
It'd be
thank
great.
you.
So, thank you, everyone.
Next week, we're gonna come back to a topic that we scratched the surface of earlier this year. When we talked about the connections between Howard University theologians and the Indian civil rights movement in the 1940s and 50s. With a presentation on Howard Thurman, who's one of the leading theologians of the 20th century that you've never heard of. He's one of the leaders of the theological community at Howard University. And we'll have Dr. Shively Smith talking about what Howard Thurman's theology was, is, and what it means for us. And this should be very interesting. Denise will be in this chair next week. And she knows far more about Professor Thurman, Dr. Thurman, than I do. So that should be a very interesting presentation. And we will see you all. Bless you all. May you have a Murphy's Law free week. And we will see you next Sunday.